This is Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families and your window into the world of special education. Special needs parenting can be challenging, and we want to make it easier by providing you with the resources you need to help your child. Let's delve deep into the world of learning differently with your host, special education attorney Adam Dayan.
I am pleased to present my next guest on this podcast, Jodi Klaristenfeld, on the subject of supporting parents of preemies. Jodi and her husband are preemie parents themselves. Jodi is also the founder of a company called FLRRRiSH, which offers support to other preemie parents. Jodi is a client of my law firm, and we have been helping her navigate the special education system for her daughter. Jodi, it's nice to be here with you today.
Thanks so much for having me on, and thanks so much for all the support you and your firm have given my family.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. So let's get started. Why did you want to come on this podcast to tell your story?
I wanted to come on this podcast to tell my story because I think it's important for all parents to know that as soon as they realize there might be an issue with their child, whether it's in their growth or development, the sooner we can get them help, the better. I also wanted to be on the program to help destigmatize what it means to get special education and special support for your children. I take the point of view that it's wonderful that such resources exist where we live and the time and place that we live. And the sooner you can get your child help, the better off they will be and your family will be.
I think those points are so important. Some parents wait because they want to see how it's going to turn out, and it's super important to get started early when you see the initial sign of something. And you're right, there are so many resources to take advantage of to get the support you need. They're out there for you to pursue. So where does your story begin?
My story begins about 2.5 hours before my daughter was born. She was born at 28 and 4, which is 28 weeks, 4 days. I had the easiest 28 weeks of pregnancy and then the hardest 4 days without really knowing how sick I was. A whole bunch of situations occurred that I kind of thought was mostly just pregnancy catching up with me. I started to retain water and I gained weight and a whole bunch of other things. But I walked into my OB's office about 2.5 hours before my daughter was born. He took one look at me, took my blood pressure, and said, okay, we are going to go to the hospital and we are not going to leave until you have this baby. I did not understand or really comprehend anything of what he was saying. I was in shock, but also I was so sick. I was kind of also in a daze. And the next thing I knew, 3 days later, I met my daughter for the first time.
That's really scary. And it sounds like you weren't able to focus on the scary part because of what your body was experiencing.
I would say I was fortunate that I didn't have the time to panic. I'm a worrier by nature, so that probably would have made it a lot worse for me. But yes, I went into the hospital. They gave me a shot in my belly, and my OB was like, okay, we're going to get your daughter out. Everything is going to be great. And then, like I said, 3 days later, I met her for the first time.
I'm just remembering back to my twin boys who were also preemies. They came at 35 weeks and 3 days. So about 35 and a half weeks. And I just remember that unsettling feeling of what's going on. They're coming early. Is everything okay? And I'm not comparing my situation to yours. They're very different. But it's unsettling. You're expecting things to go a certain way, and then they go differently, and you have to respond, right?
Yes. There's a whole bunch of emotions that run through parents' heads. Of course, the first thing is, what's wrong? What's my baby, what's the situation going to be with my baby when he or she or both come out, and what is going to happen to me as the mom. On top of that, as the mom, when you're dealing with healing, usually from a C-section in these situations, so your body's healing, you're hormonally healing, you're also mentally confused, isolated, alone, and questioning. And it's really, really scary. Not to mention partners or dads, too, are extremely scared as well. Though from the dads I've spoken to, by and large, they don't like to pile on the moms and explain their fears because the moms are already going through their own tumultuous time.
Sure. So before we get to your child's arrival, do you want to talk a little bit about what was going on or why this was happening? Is there anything that you want listeners to know about what was causing this so that they can be prepared if they're in similar circumstances?
Yes. I had preeclampsia and HELP syndrome. Now, preeclampsia is common enough that people should be aware of it. And the great thing is that now a new test has come out, and that should be rolling out very soon to help be an early predictor of whether someone is more susceptible to preeclampsia. HELP syndrome often accompanies preeclampsia in extreme cases, but you don't have to have one to have the other. I got the double whammy. I was lucky, I guess. So for me, first of all, I had gained 6.5 pounds up until at my 28-week mark with my daughter. And then when I went into my OB's office 4 days later, I had gained over 20 pounds. And that's a huge red flag when all of a sudden there's an extreme weight gain. That was water retention. I also started to get a bloody nose that I couldn't stop from bleeding. That, too, is a sign of increased blood pressure as well. But I thought since it was cold outside and it was January and going in and out of hot and cold, that there was nothing wrong with that. I also started to see double, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I saw double coupled with getting protein in my urine, which I didn't know at the time what that was. And so those things combined as well. And when I saw double, I was like, okay, I have to call my OB. There is something very wrong here. So if you start to not feel well in any way, shape, or form, I implore you to go to your doctor. Even if you get a headache. Now, my blood pressure was 190 over like 150, near stroke levels. And I didn't have any headaches. And that's actually a very common symptom of preeclampsia. But I didn't have that. But if you start to feel off, and I did feel off, please go to your doctor.
Yeah, wow. That's a lot.
Yes. And actually, I was fortunate. The unfortunate part was my husband was in Europe while this was happening because it was 12 weeks beforehand. But fortunately, my mother was in town, and we were going to go and look at baby furniture, not necessarily have the baby. So I was fortunately not alone in this situation. And so again, too, if any of you are alone, if your husband or partner is traveling, go to the doctor, go with a friend, because you might also need someone else to help you make those decisions for you.
Okay, so let's define preemie for our listeners. You mentioned that your child came 12 weeks early. I mentioned before that my twin boys came at 35 and a half weeks. They were also technically considered preemie. So at what stage is a child considered to be a preemie?
A preemie is any baby born less than 37 weeks gestation, or conversely, if 37 weeks and more is considered full term. And generally 40 weeks is what the gestation period is.
Okay, and you mentioned finding out 2.5 hours before your daughter was born that there was a problem. So all of these symptoms that you described so articulately, they're all affecting you in that period a couple of hours before she's actually born, and you realize, hey, you got to get to the hospital immediately, or was it a bigger window than that? Do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
I walked into my OB's office, I can tell you, at 12:30. I walked into the hospital at 1 o'clock. She was born at 3:16. I was knocked out completely. To me, both my OB and my mom seemed the picture of calm, which is what you want in a doctor, especially. And but my OB said to my mom, "We have to get the baby now or else we will lose them both."
Wow.
And if so, and I have to choose, then who? And my mom said she was already pale, like all the color had drained from her face. And she was just like, I can't believe I'm being asked these questions. So it was a very, very quick window, to the point that I remembered about 1.5 years later, I said to my mom, when we went to the hospital, I don't think we even waited for an elevator, nor did we stop on any of the floors. And my mom said, well, because the hospital knew we were coming. We barely even had to check in. Literally, they just rushed me through. And immediately, I went to the OR and had my daughter.
Your daughter is born, and she ends up going into the NICU. Can you paint a picture of what it's like to be thrust into life as NICU parents?
I don't think anyone could ever be fully prepared for seeing their child or children in the NICU when they're born. We have this picture-perfect vision of what we think childbirth is going to look like. And even in your case where you had twins, I'm sure that the doctors warned you there was a large probability that your children were going to be born early and in the NICU, at least for a little, for observation. That said, those moments when you walk through the doors of the NICU and you see your child in an isolette hooked up to machines, bells, whistles, it's this out-of-body experience. Yet also at the same time, you become a medical parent. It's as if you have gone to medical school overnight without ever having enrolled in the 4-year program. You are thrown into a world of many acronyms and names and situations you have not the faintest idea of what anything is. And
even under the best of circumstances, that's a lot to take in, let alone what you were dealing with.
Oh, yes. I remember walking into the NICU. I wanted to take the wheelchair, and my husband wouldn't let me. Now, my room was closest to the NICU. Again, I was that case in the hospital. Every single person on the floor knew who I was, and I couldn't quite figure out why. And I walked in, and I remember seeing her, and I just started to cry. I was so happy, and I was also so scared. I didn't want to touch her. I was just so fragile myself. And then also seeing her look so tiny, I thought she was so fragile. But in those moments, I also looked around and realized how strong these kids are for fighting so hard for every breath and for everything that they're doing. But at the same time, as a parent, there's just so much confusion and you don't understand. And as a mom, you think, well, did I do something wrong? Did I eat fish that maybe had mercury or was too raw, or did I exercise? I mean, you start questioning everything.
The guilt factor.
Yes. Whether there was something you did or didn't do. And chances are that has nothing to do with why your child was born early. But I will say all those feelings of being happy yet so scared at the same time, while it feels crazy to say that, right? Because that's a crazy juxtaposition of emotions, is completely, completely normal. when you're going through something that is so unorthodox.
Sure. I'm going to ask you more about that in a moment. First, talk about what support did you need and receive in the hospital, besides what you've mentioned so far.
I want to make a point to say that all the doctors and the nurses and the staff and the specialists who worked in our NICU, and probably who work in any NICU for that matter, are a rare breed of people. They are true angels, and they are so warm and caring towards your child. And I feel like Jenna did so well in the hospital, part and parcel, because they loved on her. In the moments we weren't there, or even when we were there, they treated her as if she was their child. And it takes a special person to be able to deal with that, plus parents whose emotions are on overload and having such confusion. That said, I'll say for me and my husband, what we needed in terms of support for ourselves and what we needed to figure out what our parenthood journey was going to look like once our daughter left the hospital, we didn't have much support in that arena at all. And from a mental health perspective, you know, that definitely took a toll. I have a wonderful husband who's super supportive. My OB was also incredible in telling me to cut myself some slack and just process everything that just happened, you know, before being so tough on myself as a mother. But by and large, we didn't know anyone else who had been in a similar situation. And all I wanted to hear was a success story. A story of someone whose child had been in the NICU, had thrived, and went home. And what did it look like once they went home? We didn't have any of that.
And I imagine that there are listeners out there who don't know other people who have been in this situation. And I'm hoping that this episode will serve as information for them, reassurance for them, an example of a success story for them so that they can navigate this type of situation in a calmer, more assured way.
Yes, me too. I mean, and that was one of my impetuses for forming FLRRiSH, and in watching my daughter fight every single day and grow and develop and flourish. And also as human beings every day, we're growing and learning and flourishing. And I just want parents out there to know they are not alone. It's so scary. And chances are you don't know someone, even though prematurity happens about 10.5% of pregnancies per year.
Okay. And I know we're throwing around the acronym NICU. I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that: neonatal intensive care unit. How long were you in the hospital after giving birth before you were allowed to go home?
I was in the hospital 11 days myself before I went home. They had to regulate all my blood levels. So from the HELP syndrome, my liver was shutting down, my blood cell count was out of whack. They were actually giving me platelets as they were taking Jenna from my body. And my OB said to my mom, if I need to, can I give her a hysterectomy? Because they didn't know if my blood would clot or if they'd be able to close from doing the C-section. Fortunately, none of that happened. But so I was in the hospital because my blood pressure was still so out of whack. And it became like almost like the self-fulfilling prophecy. Every time they took my blood pressure, I'd just get so nervous that it would be off the charts, even with medication anyway.
So 11 days, you were allowed to go home 11 days after giving birth. I'm just trying to remember how long you were in the hospital before giving birth. We said just a couple of hours. And how about your daughter? What was her stay like? How long was she in the NICU or the hospital?
She was in the hospital for 77 days. She came home 3 days before her due date, which is typical. When I first met with doctors after she was born, they said to plan on her coming home, assuming everything went according to plan, around her due date, and she did come home right before then.
So I want to ask you about what it's like when you come home from the hospital, but I'm just focusing on this period where you're home and your daughter is still in the hospital. Do you want to talk about what that is like?
Again, it's one of those interesting complexities. You go into the hospital, you have a baby, you think you're going to come home with your child, maybe 2-3 days later, depending if natural or C-section. And I remember wanting so bad to leave the hospital and breathe fresh air and sleep in my own bed, but at the same time wanting to stay and feeling so torn how I could leave the hospital. And every day when I would go back to the hospital after I left, I wondered, how could I leave her here? We were, again, I know I keep using the word fortunate, but it's so true. Our NICU had these cameras that could see inside the isolettes, or when she got older and more developed, into a bassinet. So even if we weren't there, we could see in. So that provided actually a lot of comfort in those moments. But my husband and I decided that we wanted to be there as most as we could. So I was there between 4 and 5 hours in the morning, and he was there between 4 and 5 hours in the afternoon. But it's this crazy feeling when you leave, but you don't come home with your child. And you're like, well, but I know there's a crib here and there should be someone in the crib or the bassinet. And it's really hard to explain to people that confusion. And I had friends tell me, well, at least you'll get to sleep while the baby is in the hospital. And I said, I'm like, okay, at least I get to sleep. But really, no, it's not even about that. I'm so worried about her struggling. I mean, and because the hospital could call at any moment about something. And they did twice. My husband went, I want to say around 9-10 o'clock at night, back to the hospital because she needed blood transfusions, which is very common in premature babies. So we were always wondering if the phone was going to ring. So there wasn't like it was a restful sleep. It was just a constant worry. Man,
it's I'm not going to even try to summarize what I think you did it beautifully. I'm just saying off the record, it's a lot to deal with. And I think you were very articulate in explaining what those emotions were like. Okay, so after 77 days, your daughter gets to come home finally. I want to hear, what was that like for her finally to be able to come home from the hospital? And then what should parents expect when they're finally able to come home from the hospital with their child?
When she came home, I remember being so excited and so happy, yet terrified. Again, it's that juxtaposition of emotions and feelings just when your child is born. And because she had been hooked up to machines, they did take off her monitors and everything when we graduated from the NICU. And my husband and I were able to sleep on the peds floor her last night at the hospital as if she were a typical baby. You sleep there after your baby is born. And they still had her
on the pediatrics floor. Last night in the hospital, you were sleeping in the hospital with her.
Yes. And of course, my husband and I didn't get a wink of sleep. Every gurgle, everything, like most parents, we were up. But when she came home, I already had, I'll say, a schedule of what I had to do for her. And I think it's important to note that your journey as a preemie parent doesn't end the minute you come home from the hospital. I would argue it gets harder because there's no 24/7 help. There are no monitors. Yes, they do make machines such as the Owlet and things like that, but our NICU really advised strongly against getting those machines. And I think I would never have slept if we had those. But So, but I had a whole schedule of different specialists she had to see in addition to our pediatrician. And also, our pediatrician was, who I'd spoken to prior, was emphatic about starting the whole early intervention process now that she was home, trying to get her those services to help her with her growth and development. So instead of necessarily enjoying every single moment and snuggling, which we did, for me, I was still in fight or flight mode. I tell people I was kind of treading water, barely with my chin above the water for about 2.5 years. But literally making phone calls, following up with specialists, making sure all of her reports were sent. There's a lot, and that's draining in and of itself. But also, again, like I said, I was so happy that she came home. I didn't believe she was coming home until she was strapped in the car seat.
And I want to make sure we're underscoring this part, your advocacy, because you were so and still are so diligent and organized and assertive and persistent in following up with the doctor's offices, the agencies, the specialists to get your child what she needs. And it's just that type of attitude and approach that you need to have when you're dealing with the Department of Health or with the Department of Education to get what your child is entitled to. So first of all, I want to say kudos for being so on top of things. And secondly, that it's so important to have that attitude in approaching these issues.
Well, thank you. You know, Jenna was born early, and I didn't have the luxury of taking a wait and see approach. It was more, okay, tell me what the situation is. Let's tackle it. Let's look at it head on. I didn't want to have my head in the sand about anything. I come from a family, I run a family business, but before that, my parents were educators. And education was always important. And that starts really from day one. And even when she was in the NICU, we were constantly reading and singing and telling her all about her family. And when she came out, my number one goal for her, aside for her to eat, sleep, and grow, those are what I told her jobs were, eat, sleep, and grow, was for me to get her the support she needed to help her grow and develop the way typical kids do. And that involves this early intervention system, which is wonderful to have. It just sometimes moves very slowly. And in that, I figured out that I needed to get help aside from that because of all the paperwork and all the